So we begin this morning with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who is scheduled to touch down in Russia in about 1 hour. And Russian President Vladimir Putin is now speaking out ahead of his arrival. At a press conference just moments ago, Putin said he has heard the United States is preparing another strike on Syria, this one in its capital city of Damascus. He also said U.S. actions in Syria remind him of its weapons of mass destruction claims in Iraq. The U.S. has yet to comment. Secretary Tillerson, meanwhile, left Pisa, Italy this morning after meeting with other foreign ministers at the G7 summit. Now, Syria dominated that conversation and will likely dominate talks in Russia, too. Our Margaret Brennan is in Moscow with a preview.
It's unclear whether Russia failed to take this obligation seriously or Russia has been incompetent. But this distinction doesn't much matter to the dead.
Hours ahead of his trip to Moscow, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson criticized Russia for propping up Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
Russia has really aligned itself with the Assad regime, the Iranians, and Hezbollah. Is that a long-term alliance that serves Russia's interest?
This week, the White House signaled that President Trump may take further military action.
The answer is that if you gas a baby, if you put a barrel bomb in to innocent people, I think you will see a response from this president.
The Kremlin condemned the U.S. attack and said it damaged already fragile U.S. relations, a blow to President Trump's campaign promise to improve them.
You know, when you think about it, wouldn't it be nice if we actually did get along with Russia?
The change in rhetoric is striking. Tillerson will urge Russia to stop propping up Assad, prevent further use of chemical weapons, and raise concerns about election meddling. A former oil executive, Rex Tillerson has extensive experience in Russia. President Vladimir Putin once awarded him the Order of Friendship. But now that he's America's top diplomat, that only goes so far. The U.S. strikes may complicate achieving any of his goals. Russian International Affairs Council Director Andrei Kortunov.
It has become even more difficult for Trump, but it is now even more difficult for Putin as well, because he has to show that he's a strong leader and that he will not yield under the U.S. pressure.
And our Margaret Brennan joins us now from Moscow. So, Margaret, let's begin with those remarks we heard from Secretary Tillerson at the G7 summit ahead of his flight. Did we hear anything new with regards to Russia or Syria?
Not really. Actually, Vlad, what you heard from Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, was him laying out a long process for the Assad reign to come to an end, though he said all the world leaders he met with unanimously agree that Assad must go. But what he said first is there needs to be a ceasefire, that Russia should continue to lead on negotiating. Then we have to get into political transition talks, and then Assad goes while the U.S. is fighting ISIS. So basically, while the rhetoric is getting ramped up saying that, Russia really needs to stop continuing to prop up Bashar al-Assad, there is no U.S.-led effort here to oust Assad from power. This is really just about getting those chemical weapons attacks to stop and trying to reduce some of this violence.
And so, has the White House or the State Department said anything about the options on the table for pressuring Putin to stop supporting Assad and allowing these chemical attacks to take place?
Well, there haven't been any public threats made in terms of what the U.S. is willing to do to Russia, because, frankly, it's not at all clear that the Trump administration wants to go head-to-head with Russia over this. What you've heard from the Secretary of State is that they really want Russia to abide by that 2013 agreement to remove the chemical weapons from Syria. That's actually the minimum of what they're asking right now. Simply stop the chemical attacks. But they would also like Russia to start transitioning their support away from Assad towards some other leader of Syria. This is not a threat here. What is actually a challenge is that those U.S. strikes have in many ways made it almost harder for Rex Tillerson or for Donald Trump to be able to get to any kind of compromise with Russia, because what we heard from analysts here is that in many ways these strikes have backed Russia's President Vladimir Putin into a bit of a corner. At least publicly, he can't look like he's backing down. And remember, Moscow's not the only player here. You also have Iran, which has fighters on the ground via terrorist groups like Hezbollah. Hezbollah, and there are other players here. So really, in pressuring Russia, it's actually pressuring them to sort of begin a transition process away from Assad. It's not do this or else.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Margaret, we talk so much about the United States' relationship with Russia when it comes to Syria without remembering that Iran is a very big part of the situation there and will be of the solution. We also know Secretary Tillerson will be meeting with his Russian counterpart during his trip, but not Putin himself. So is there anything we should be reading into that?
Well, it's actually not clear yet. I know from traveling here with past secretaries of state covering their trips to Moscow that the only thing they publicly announced is the meeting between the two top diplomats. Sergei Lavrov will be meeting with Secretary of State Tillerson. I think depending on how that meeting goes, he may or may not get some FaceTime with President Vladimir Putin. His schedule isn't something that they often make public, and he often keeps world leaders waiting until he's ready to talk. So I think we'll be able to gauge whatever level of success there is from Tillerson's visit in many ways by whether or not he gets Vladimir Putin to give him the time of day. Remember, the two have a relationship that goes back some time. He was awarded an Order of Friendship for all his work here as an oil executive. We don't know if that'll actually in any way change the chemistry or change his negotiating leverage in the room now that he's America's top diplomat and pushing Russia on so many fronts, not just Syria, but also talking about Ukraine, pushing them to come to some kind of new arms agreement when it comes to U.S.-Russia nuclear weapons. A lot of fronts here that there's a lot of tension, including that alleged election meddling, not only in the U.S. but in Europe.
Absolutely. So much to talk about. Margaret Brennan in Moscow for us. Thank you, Margaret.